first day, we have a creation of the universe. That gets a big double check. Realize, until 50 years ago, the overwhelming opinion of the scientific community was, how old is the universe? Eternal. The Greek view. It's a hard pill for the average secularist to accept the fact, because most people now hold that the universe at the beginning, that very recently, until very recently, the overwhelming opinion was that this diagram, you show this diagram in the university, and you get thrown out of the university because we all know the universe is eternal. What do we know now? The fact is the universe had a beginning, it's called the Big Bang. So the creation is a big deal. Give it a big check. Creation. Huge check. Got it right there. And then we have this concept of something very interesting. If you look at the text that was passed around, I'm doing it in the English. On the side it's open with wisdom on the top. The word wisdom at the top. God creates the heavens and the earth, but that's a general statement of the creation, because the next sentence says in the Hebrew, there was no earth yet. It hadn't been formed. But what happens? It says here in the English, the wind of God moved over. Now, that Hebrew is Ruach Elokim Merachefet. Ruach Elokim. Ruach means wind or spirit. Okay? Elokim is the aspect of God. Of which aspect of God? God has many aspects, like an author has many voices. The aspect of God is manifest in nature. The only name for God in Genesis chapter 1 is the aspect of God, Elohim, that makes it God made manifest in nature, because God is working through nature to make the world. Otherwise, God would have needed 6 days. I mean, what does God need 6 days for? You know, God needs 6 days like a whole day. God could have made the universe like that. So why schlep it out over 6 days? Why drag it out over 6 days? Because God works through time. That's the measure. And from the perspective of the Bible, looking forward, not as we look back, but from the perspective of the Bible looking forward, it was 6 24-hour days from here to here. But from our perspective, it's 14 billion years going back in time. There's two perspectives. Looking forward from the beginning, the biblical perspective, going back in time, using our measurements going back in time. So let's just see if we can zip through some of this and see if we can't get okay, so it says here in the second sentence, the Spirit of God, or I want to give it closer to the Hebrew, Ruach Elohim Merachefet. So the Spirit of God is said very rarely. But the Spirit of God hovering over the surface, or the Spirit of God moved, Ruach Elohim Merachefet, is not rare, it's unique. It appears nowhere else in the entire biblical text. Nowhere. The Spirit of God hovering, and Merachefet only appears one other place also in Deuteronomy by itself, as an eagle hovers over its wings to get the babies to learn to fly, okay? Ruach Elohim Merachefet, the Spirit of God hovering, is a one-time force that happens in the second sentence of the Bible, and at that moment, and I would say, and I say in Genesis the Big Bang, I would not say it's exactly this, but science calls for, notice this word, inflation, calls for an event to occur. Whether it's inflation with a capital I, the explicit theory, or whether just it's something in general, the sudden explosion which is not necessarily understood totally, immediately after the creation of the universe comes a one-time force that never occurs again and can never occur again, unless there was some kind of a collapse to the universe. And that inflation breaks the universe free, starts the universe expanding, and science does not like one-time forces. It's like juggling the data. But it is intriguing that the Torah brings a one-time force, the Spirit of God hovering, and science brings a one-time force, inflation, and after that the same thing happens. That light breaks free and moves on out, and moves out. And this burst of light coming out of it. You know, not the light of the creation, the universe expands, because until that inflation occurs and the universe moves out, life was literally locked inside this tremendous expanding ball, which is the entire universe. It wasn't like over here or over there, it's the whole thing. But that's it. It's hard to get that into your head, because, you know, we see such differences today in the world, but everything was this, the universe is expanding out, and once it expands enough, as the universe expands, you have a given amount of temperature, a given amount of energy. So what would happen? As the universe expands, would the universe get hotter or colder? You got a given amount of heat, and you're going to put it into a bigger, hotter or colder?
Colder.
Colder. It's exactly, why is there snow on the top of Kilimanjaro? And the bottom of the shade is 100 degrees. So why is there snow on the top? Because as that hot air hits the mountain, it's forced to go up the mountain. So you got this amount of, and as it goes up the mountain, the air pressure becomes less, right? And what happens to that ball of air? Does it expand or contract? expands. And so what happens? The heat gets diluted into more and more space, and you finally get up to freezing weather. And then it comes down on the other side, and the heat is condensed again. So as the universe expands, it gets colder. And as it gets colder, the what's called the plasma is frozen. It cools off. I don't know how to say it properly. And out breaks light. And notice in the biblical text, light breaks free. So we have this one-time force. I give it a half a check, okay? I call it inflation. The Ruach had the Spirit of God hovering. I give it a half a check because we can't prove that it's that, but it is kind of unique. You can't say kind of unique. Something's either unique or not unique. You can't say it's almost unique. Okay? Grammatically it's wrong. So it is unique that these two things happen, but it's almost unique. And then light breaks free. And then light breaks free. Light gets free. So we got a lot of good things. Remember, we're only given a few sentences here where science studies billions of years, 7 billion years worth of history. Now then we have this day, the second day started. I have a problem with the second day because the Mikubalim don't talk about it. They say it's one of the great secrets in the Torah, what happens here. But what is interesting here is that in the text of the second day, which begins on verse number 6, we see that there's a firmament in the heads, in the waters, space, okay? And this firmament is called heaven. Now if you look up at the sky, in a black, away from a city, you see this carpet of light. You don't see it in the city at all, but you get out in a desert or place, you see a carpet of light. And I think that's what it's talking about. I don't know. So I give it like a half of a check that it's the Milky Way. Because what we see is a carpet of stars, which starts right about here somewhere, is the Milky Way, our galaxy. Whether this firmament in the heavens is that, I don't know, hence only a half a check. But the Mikubalim don't say any more about that, and I only use these ancient commentaries. I'm not trying to bang what the Bible is saying to what I think happened, so I use only ancient commentaries. We talked about it yesterday, the Talmud, Rashi, Maimonides, Nachmanides, over 1,000 years ago. So we're talking about way before Hubble telescopes. Okay, so we zip down to day number 3. Day number 3, interestingly, starts almost right on the buttons. Day number 3 starts here, and we have here the Cambrian explosion of life. 3.5. Oh, excuse me, what am I running here? I'm putting strange things. Let me erase that. I jumped ahead by 2 or 3 days. Day number 3. Well, what happens on day number 3? Day number 3 has the first forms of life. As we have life. And that matches the Bible's statement right off the bat. Now on day number 3, there's a nuance here. On day number 3, it talks about several types of plant matter. The Mikubalim saying that all the plants that are mentioned on day number 3 do not necessarily appear on day number 3. It's to use the words of Nachmanides, it's the beginning of an ongoing act. So why are all these different things mentioned, like fruit-bearing trees wouldn't appear to day number 6, day 5 or 6. So why is it mentioned here? There's a way that the Torah works. When it has a piece of information that is of an ongoing phenomena, but it's not related to the events that are ongoing, it just, it's like peripheral. Then the Torah wraps it up and puts it aside. We see that at the end at the end of chapter 11 of Genesis, the beginning of chapter 12, where it talks about the birth of Abraham, and the father is Terah. And it gives you the ages when Terah became the father of Abraham. In those days, in the early days of Avram, he's named Abraham in chapter 17. Then it mentions about Terah's death, and it gives the year. That's the last Terah, the father of Abraham, is never mentioned again after chapter number 11. But the dates that Abraham goes, meaning Sarah, having their children, are all given. Terah is alive through chapter 18, but he's never mentioned again. He only mentioned in chapter 11. He did something right. He was the father of Abraham. But he's never mentioned again because he's not relevant to the ongoing story. Even though the years that are listed let you know when he died, but that's all mentioned back in chapter 11. But the years that go through, like the birth of Isaac, Terah was alive. But you never hear about him bouncing Isaac on his knee. because he's not relevant to the story. Now, Nachmanides uses the same logic with day number 3. He says the plants that appear on day number 3, it's a part of an ongoing act, but it wraps it aside. The Torah is into green peace. It talks about what kind of trees, if you're having a war, what kind of trees you can cut down, what kinds of trees you can't cut down. It knows about planting this, certain types of crops next to other types of crops. So the Torah is into green peace, but it's not relevant to the story of the flow of the major figures that are leading towards Sinai. So that's day number 3, but it's a big check because life does go back right to here. It goes back to somewhere, a circle, right about here. Maybe 3.6, maybe 3.8, maybe 3.5, but the beginning of life. It's a pretty big deal that it would mention that. Now day number 4, day number 4 is kind of interesting because people are always asking, well, how can it be? The day number 4 starts in verse number 14, and we see the suns and the moon are mentioned for the first time, which makes it problematic for the statements of evening and morning for the other days, since evening and morning relate to the sunrise and sunset. So, but what we do have here is were the planets here earlier? And a close reading of the text, not by me, but by Rashi and the Talmud, tells us that the sun and moon were there earlier, but they only become visible, called fixed in their position, seen in this day. The Talmud says it, Rashi says it. I would say it also, but then I say it has no significance. You know, I know the geology. What happened on the Earth at this time is an exact match. The Earth forms from, and the solar system, from previous supernova stars exploded. 5 billion years ago, you and I were stardust, as the chair you're sitting on and everything else you see around you. We're stardust. Then gravity pulls this stardust together, starts rotating, you get most of the stuff, most of this stardust, these 2 or 3 exploding stars, gets pulled for the center of this rotating mass, becomes the sun, because the pressures become high enough to ignite the sun, fusion of hydrogen to helium. And then around it, some rocky planets form, and further out, some gaseous planets. When it gets cold enough, far enough away from the sun, you get gaseous planets where ammonia, etc., form from the sun to get a big gaseous planet. So we have the Earth forming 3 planets out. It forms from a molten mass. It cools. We get a crust. This is basically a few of these aspects here, because there's a lot more detail that we can talk in. But the Earth starts out hot. All the original forms of life, the most primitive forms of life, are thermophiles, heat lovers. All the microbes are thermophiles. We can see that from past mutations that they are ancient, okay, and dating back to here. But what happens in this region right here is that the Earth starts to cool. Before this, it was so hot when water, and we have an Earth with massive amounts of water on it, which means a lot of vapor pressure because it's hot, which means a cloudy day in London town, which means that you can't even see the sun or the moon. Now, I made literally hundreds of measurements of photosynthesis when it is so overcast that you can't see the bright spot in the sky. You don't need a flashlight, but usually with a thin overcast you can't see the sun, but you can see a glow behind the clouds. I made measurements of photosynthesis when it is completely overcast and the plants are still pumping out oxygen right and left. You don't need coherent light or a visible sun to have photosynthesis. You need a sun. And what happens in this period right here is that the Earth cools, the cloudy, overcast globe becomes clear, the water condenses, and we have a visible sky. So that we can see the sun and the moon. You know, again, I only give it like maybe even a quarter check because we don't know that that's the case, that's what that's referring to. But the fact that the sun and the moon are mentioned for this time, even though the ancient commentators say the sun and the moon were there earlier, they just become visible, fixed in their position. Well, that's exactly what happens in this time period. The Earth cools, the overcast condenses, the atmosphere clears, and suddenly we can see the celestial bodies and the stars. They're already up there because the Milky Way is formed way back here. Our sun would be forming somewhere in about here, somewhere down here. The Milky Way forms here. Our solar system is somewhere about here. Okay, then we get to day number 5. We're getting closer now, so we have much more information. And day number 5, the author, as it were, of the Bible has this huge chutzpah to make the statement that, what did it say here? They were just really outrageous. It says wrong. Beginning of day number 5 and verse number 20, that the waters teem abundantly with living creatures. Really? The Torah says that in this time period here, between here and here, there will be an explosion of life, that the waters teem abundantly with living creatures. That's called the Cambrian explosion of life, evolution's Big Bang. That the Torah, this like gets 2 checks because it's so phenomenal. It's the first forms of life, of animal life, are in the waters, and it's an explosion of life. An explosion of life, that the waters teem with teams of living creatures. That's the first mention of animal life. It's verse number 20. By verse 26 we have Adam already. Notice how it's all compressed. The information is all compressed. But this is the Cambrian explosion of life, and it's pretty amazing that we have here. This is from Time Magazine, and you can get, obviously get stronger sources, but the drawings are so lovely here. It's in the, notice it's in the waters. It's blue, it's in the waters. It's an explosion of life, evolution's Big Bang. Even Scientific American calls it the Big Bang of animal evolution. It's the Cambrian explosion of life. The fossil record goes way back to here. Microbe, and then, right smack dab in the middle, approximately 530 million years ago, an explosion of life in which animals are not only present, they're of such a size you can see them. Before the Cambrian explosion of life, to see any individual animal, you needed a microscope. Which is interesting, because that would mean you could, I'm not talking about lettuce, but you only have to check. You don't need a microscope to check lettuce. You realize that, right? Any other, right? If you can't see the bug, halachically, it's not there. It could be crawling with all kinds of worms that are subvisible. True way. They are completely considered kosher. If you can't see it with your eye, it's considered not to be. You don't need a microscope to check it. But in any event, everything, and it's funny, all that, everything was kosher before this time. There were no bugs in it. The bugs may have been there, but they didn't really put no people around, obviously. And even with the animals, are keeping kosher. So we have this explosion of life. And what's amazing about this explosion of life is that every body plan that exists today comes into being as a sudden burst of energy. And this is summarized very nicely by one of the major shakers and movers of evolution, evolutionary developmental biology. Brian K. Hall is one of the biggies in the field. I just took a book off the shelf in the Harmon Library and copied a few pages. The book wasn't a copy very fancy, just a few pages. Until recently, we contented ourselves with notions of a gradual progression of structural organization from a few simple types to the abundance of organisms available today. Really? Notions? I don't know if there's a notion or there's a fact. I know the fact that first came sponges, and then came worms, and then came insects, and then came mollusks, and then came our phylum Chordata. No, that's what we all learned. A notion? It was never sent as a notion. It was a fact. The reinterpretation of the Burgess Shale fossils, and now thousands of other fossils over great, by Conway, Morris, and Whittington in 1985 changed all that. Representatives of every phylum are found in the early and middle Cambrian rocks. This raises enormous questions concerning the radiation of body plans. No new body plans have evolved since. It doesn't mean there were little people sleeping through lectures at that time. That's not what it's talking about. What it's talking about, there are 30 or 34 body plans, and they all appear simultaneously out of the blue. Our body plan is called Chordata. Bilaterally symmetrical, stereoscopic, stereophonic, internal skeleton, separate sexes, complex digestion, that defines people, fish, dinosaurs, lizards, birds, but it doesn't describe worms. They're different. It's a different body plan. It doesn't describe mollusks. Different body plan. Doesn't describe insects. Different body plans. Okay? Those body plans all appear suddenly out of the blue. And one of them I have here. By the time I tell you how I was given it, it's crazy. But I don't have time for that, so I just can show it to you. This is my daughter's son. And this is it. If you get a close-up of this, is quite amazing. It's been on national television in the States a few times. It's a trilobite. It's the first of the insects. They're rare, but not phenomenally rare. It was a gift. The perfect ones have arms. Here's the trilobite. with the perfect one, okay? Section, body, 3 cents tried. But most amazingly of all, what are these 2 things here? What do you think these are? Right here. Eyes. Eyes. Microscopic, 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 microscope, and then out of the blue comes insects with eyes. And according to the journal of science, in the perfectly formed, this is crude, hence it's not in the museum. When they fossilize with volcanic silt, finer than talc, you can actually measure the shapes of the lenses. What's the difference between an insect eye and a human eye, as far as lenses go? They're multifaceted. They have lots of lenses. These have lots of lenses already. It's amazing. Does it prove there's a God? I don't think so. Does it prove you don't understand evolution? 100%. That's the one sentence I was ever getting from the New York Times. It doesn't prove there's a God one or the other, but it proves we don't understand evolution. And that might mean God. That's for each person to make their own decision. So it's pretty amazing. There are 3 types of animal life, body plans, that have image-forming vision. We're one of them, chordata, like birds and people and that. The other is insects, and the other is mollusks. All 3 enter the fossil record with eyes. There are other phyla that sense light, like worms can sense light. I'm talking about image forming, like I can see you as an image. Insects, mollusks, chordata, and they all enter the fossil record with eyes. And they entered about 530 million years ago, which matched bingo right on exactly on the timeline that is mentioned here. And that's just pretty extraordinary. And then the text goes on day number 5 and says a few other little things that I can't imagine how it could possibly have such gall that the author could really believe that, and it turns out to be right after right. Then the next part says, let birds fly above the earth. We're going to run a few minutes over. Is that okay? Just try to finish. And it says, let birds fly above the earth in this translation. Another translation says, fowl fly above the earth. Now we've got a problem here, because the text says oath. Now one of the leading paleobiologists died a few years ago, Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard University. My background's MIT, so I don't hold it against him up to the news at Harvard. But at Harvard University, he was one of the leading paleobiologists, the person that studies evolution by looking at fossils. And Gould proved that the Bible was wrong. I want to get this very clearly. In his field, if I talk about biology, it's meaningless because I just read secondary or primary literature, but it's not my field. But this is Gould's work. And Stephen Jay Gould, bless him, Mary, died of cancer a few years ago. By now, I hope he knows the right answer, because if he doesn't, we're wasting our time here. So Gould wrote like this. He said, first of all, I'm a Levite. He's going to give credentials for understanding the Bible. He's my forefathers served in the temple. So that makes him a Levite or Cohen. And he's Jewish. You must know something. His forefathers served in the temple. So what does he tell us about? He said, well, in my field, I can show you the Bible is wrong. And how can I show you? And he shows us verse verse number 20, where it says that the waters teem abundantly, that's the Cambrian explosion, and birds that fly above the earth. And another translation by the Arts Cosby, and fowl that fly above the earth. Well, he says point blank, there's an error. Birds don't appear until day number 6 animals. Nor are there any birds in the day number 5 type of animals. But Gould didn't know Hebrew. That's what makes such a sprite guy, and he's bleeding hard for helping the world. And it's better for conversation. He was a wonderful human being. And he thought the Bible was beautiful as literature. But he thought Gilbert and Sullivan was beautiful also as literature, as music. So why would a person with his brains that doesn't know Hebrew mouth off about the Bible? Because the text doesn't say bird, and the text doesn't say fowl. It says oath. That's the word that's written in the center in Hebrew there. It says oath. Now, oath today in modern Hebrew, you go into a butcher, what do you get? A chicken, but not in biblical Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew, oath, and Hebrew is such an ancient language, you can hear in the letters, oath, oath, from flight. Oath is an animal that flies. Oath is an animal that flies. What's one of the first animals that flew?
Pterodactyl.
Insects, of course. Now, pterodactyls are birds already. Insects, of course. And it's almost like a proof around the corner. It's so beautiful. Insects map exactly onto the water-dwelling animals. If you look at the modern understanding from the scientific community how flight was invented, it wasn't invented by land animals. It was invented by worms that live in the water, and then they come to the surface in the evening, only in the evening, I've watched this happen, they open up the cocoon like a caterpillar, but it's underwater, form a canoe, and fly out. The chironomid is one, the stonefly is another. Read the literature. Insects were the first animals to fly, and they come from water-dwelling animals. We should say, crazy, how can they fly? The wings will get wet. They don't get wet. They're a worm about this size when you trim your fingernail, about that size. They wiggle to the surface like a dolphin does, I guess. They have no appendages that you can see. Then they open up, they unzip the top, never the bottom. They unzip the top of the cocoon, it makes a canoe. Out flies the fly, dry and flying. Flight is invented. It's like an around-the-corner proof. It's just so amazing. And it's a problem with people who criticize the Bible when it's not what the Bible says. Like some theologian says, oh, the earth is the center of the universe. It may be spiritually, but nowhere in the Bible does it say the earth is the center of the universe. In fact, the first sentence which comes first? The heavens and then the earth. It's not even mentioned first. So anyway, not around. But I want to get into one thing here, and then we'll end it. We just leave number 6 for another day. And that is the great crocodiles. That's pretty strange. You see that in verse number 21. And God created, it's still day 5, the great crocodiles. It's the Hebrews Taninim Gedolim. Now, it also, I've seen great dragons. I've even seen great whales. The King James Version is whale. But what does it really say? What does the text? It says Taninim Gedolim. The singular of Taninim is Tanim. The im is the masculine S in English. Taninim. Gedolim. But Gedol means big. So you got these big taninim. So what's a big taninim? Why should we call here a crocodile, King James a whale, elsewhere I've seen dragons, monsters, the whole kit with the board, but we know what tanin means. Not from Webster's dictionary, or whatever the dictionary, but from the text itself. Tanin appears in Exodus. Moses at the burning bush. God says, go back to Egypt. Let my people go. Moses says, nothing doing. God says, I'm going to give you a trick. Moses is a shepherd. He's a stick. Throw your stick on the ground, and what does it become? Snake. What's the Hebrew word for snake? Nachash. Becomes a nachash. The word's important now. Becomes a nachash. Moses goes back to Egypt, confronts Pharaoh along with his brother Aaron. Now Aaron actually he throws the stick down. Pharaoh says, show me a trick. Aaron throws the stick down on the ground, and it becomes what? A tanin. Becomes a tanin. Now, if let's pretend the King James Version, which is whale, and can you imagine Moses throws Aaron with the stick down, the whale comes in. I mean, at that point, Pharaoh would say, let your people go. When it became a crocodile, the fact that there's no statement that Moses says, oh, good grief. Moses said to Aaron, I wanted a snake, and you gave me a crocodile? What are you doing to me, Aaron? Let's get out of here. We can't control this thing. No, it's the same event. So we now know that tanin here, it's called a tanin here, the burning bush is called a nachash. We know what nachash is, no debate. Nachash means snake. The question's going on tanin. So what do we know about these two words? We know that in Genesis chapter 1, only general categories are listed, except for Adam. So a few sentences. So tanin has to be a general category, right? Genesis chapter 1, tanin gedolim, the big taninim. Tanin has to be has to be the general category within which falls snake, nachash. And it is what? Reptile. It means big reptile. That's what it means, not crocodile, big reptile. Now that's kind of interesting, because the first major translation into a totally foreign language, not like Aramaic, was the Septuagint. Translated the Hebrew Bible from Hebrew into Aramaic. Ptolemy wanted 70 Jewish scholars in, and they changed words around to make it let's say Ptolemy friendly, Greek friendly. But the irony is, had the Greek translation been faithful to the Hebrew, how do you translate big reptiles into Greek? Because that was a Greek translation. Well, how do you do it? You all know the word. Dinosaurus. Dino means big or terrible. Saurus means reptile. Dinosaurus. We would have had dinosaurs in the Bible right from the beginning had the translation been faithful to the Hebrew. But they try to make it Greek friendly. And here, just to think that they ever existed is one of them. And that's our socks. My wife, Barbara Sofer, got me this as she was trying to buy a whole dinosaur in Montana, the U.S., in northwest U.S. You can buy a whole dinosaurs from the state. It's the vertebrae of a plesiosaurus, a water-dwelling dinosaur. They existed. It's always been talked about for 3,000 years. The tiny gedolim. If we didn't have this crazy, unfortunate Greek translation, the Septuagint, we would be able to know a lot more, including the opening sentence of the Bible. So I think we have to leave it there, but we do get about another third check there because you got tiny neem, we got birds, we got insects. It's amazing. Because here we start getting more and more data. A lot of this is based on a few discoveries, but we've got lots of data. And then here we have Adam, and we have the land, and we have, let the earth bring forth living creatures. I mean, the whole kit and caboodle is humanity. So, anyway, what we find out, that we can discover how long each day was, even as the days remain. I also like to that's what I'm doing this morning. Put my head. Each day remains 24 hours each. From the Bible's perspective, not as if, not to either, not maybe, 24 hours each, looking forward from the beginning. And these are durations. We look backward from today, and it is 14 billion years, as we measure time from our time-space coordinates, and we both happen in exactly the same time. That's the heritage of the science of the universe.